Again, it's a rich thing.
What is going on, guys? Welcome back. This video is going to be a beginner course on Tkinter. We have used Tkinter a couple of times on this channel already to build graphical user interface applications, but I never published a video tutorial or a video course on the very basics of Tkinter. So what is a window? How do we set some basic stuff up? What are layouts? What are the individual widgets that we can use and so on? What are their functionality? How do I do certain things, certain basic things in Tkinter? I have used Tkinter and I have explained the process. So whenever I created something and typed some parameters, I explained what they did, but I never published a full course on the basics of Tkinter, which is what I want to do today. So let's start with the fact that if you want to use Tkinter, you need to import it, but you don't have to install it since it's part of the core Python stack. It's a library that is used to build graphical user interfaces in Python. It's the default way to build graphical user interfaces with Python. Of course, you can also go with PyQt5, for example, but that is something that you need to install. Specifically, Tkinter is part of the core Python stack. And in order to use it, we just need to say import Tkinter, and usually I like to use tk as an alias, so import Tkinter as tk. What some people like to do in tutorials, and I have done this myself as well, is to say from Tkinter import everything. Now, this is not considered to be best practice because you import more than you need, and it can lead to some ambiguity and problems. So if you can avoid it, just don't do it like that. Just import Tkinter as tk, or just import Tkinter, and then always when you want to use something, for example, a button, you don't say button, but you say tk.button, for example. Now, in order to create a window, that's quite simple. We just need to say some name for the window, for example, root or window. I'm going to call it root. And then you say tk.tk, but with a capital T, and then you call the constructor, and then all we do is we say root.mainLoop. Not like that. Root.mainLoop, like this. And by running the script here, we will see that we already have an application. So this is a very basic way to just create a simple graphical user interface window. We don't have anything in here. We don't have any dimensions set up. We don't have any title or anything like that. But this is the basic way to create the window. Now, this window has certain properties. We can set a title, we can set the geometry, and those two things are actually the most important for the beginning. So we're going to say root dot, and in order to set the geometry, we don't use a set geometry function, we just use the geometry function, and we pass to that function a string with the dimensions. So first the x value, then the y value. In this case, we could say something like 800x 500, so it would create a window with a width of 800 pixels and a height of 500 pixels. And of course, you can play around with that however you want. We can also swap that. Let's do something like 500 times 500, so we have a square, more or less. And then we can also set the title of the window by just saying root dot title my first GUI, for example. Now, if we do that, there you go. You can see that we have a title now. So those are the basics. We can set the geometry and the title. Now I want to get right into the widgets because that's what Tkinter is all about. We want to have something inside of that window. And if you want to add something to that window, you create the object, you pass this window as the parent object, and then you use a layout to get this object or this widget into the graphical user interface. Usually you use something like pack or grid. There is also place where you can just choose the coordinates, but usually you go with pack or with grid, which are the two layouts, and we're going to look at all of them today. So what we're going to do first now, let's go with a simple label. A label is just a text, so let's say label equals, and then tk.label with a capital L. And what we pass first here is the parent object. So the parent object of the label, the parent window, the master is going to be root itself. So label is going to be part of root. And then we can set some named parameters. The text of the label is going to be hello world, for example. And then we can also pass some design stuff like the font. If we want to define a font, what we do is we say font equals, and then we pass a tuple. And the first element of that tuple is going to be the font family. So Arial, for example. And the second one is going to be the font size, for example, 18 points. I think it's points, not pixels. I hope that's true. Now, if we want to get that label into the root, all we need to do is we need to specify a layout that we use. As you can see, we can use pack, we can use grid, and I think somewhere down here should also be place. There you go. We're going to go with pack for now. We're going to build everything with pack for now. And what we can add here as well is a padding. But first of all, let's see what it looks like without a padding. Not debug, sorry. Let me run this again. There you go. We have a simple label. As you can see, it's quite basically at the topmost position with a small padding, you could say, with a small distance, with a small spacing. What we can pass here is pad x equals 20, for example, and pad y equals 20. Obviously, x is for the x dimension for the horizontal padding, and y is for the vertical padding. There you go. You can see there's a little bit more distance now. So we can do that with other elements as well. Let's go with a simple text box. Text box is going to be tk.text with a capital T. Root is going to be the master object again. Then text, you can also set a text if you want to, but usually you want the user to input the text. What you can set for a text box is you can set the height. So you can say, or actually don't set the height and see what it looks like without setting the height. But we're going to add a font here, again Arial, but this time a little bit smaller. So let's say it's 16 points, and then text box dot pack, and let's just do no padding for now. And you can see that it is the whole, it stretches across the whole graphical user interface, and it has no distance here on the horizontal because, of course, we don't have any padding here. So now if I scale the window, you can see it's quite large. So if I want to set the height to something specific, I can also go ahead and say, okay, I want the height to be 3, and then it's going to be way smaller. As you can see here, it's going to be 3 lines. So I can write something here, I can write something here and here. And now, of course, I can also go down, but then I have to scroll. All right, so this is a basic text box. We can also use an entry if we want to. An entry is basically just a text box with height 1 without multi-line features and all that. So if you want to have a text box for a password, maybe an entry is more useful than a text. So let me maybe show you that. My entry is going to be tk.entry, like that, part of root, and then just my entry dot pack. And you can see that this here is an entry because it's one line. I cannot press enter. I mean, I can press enter, but nothing happens. It doesn't go into multi-line, whereas here, even if the height was 1, I can still scroll down. This is the difference. We're going to use a text box here, though. And of course, we can also add a padding. Now, maybe we don't want to have a vertical padding because we already have one from the label, and it's fine. But maybe you want to have a horizontal one, so pad x is going to be 20. And now you can see that we have some distance here. Now 20 seems to be a little bit too much, so let's go with 10. This should look fine. There you go. Now we can also add a button now, and we're going to talk about buttons later on in more detail because we got to add some functionality to the button. We're not going to do that now. I'm just showing you that you can add a button here. So a button is tk.button, and pass it to root again, and the text of the button is, for example, click me. And it can also have a font. We're going to go with Arial again, and we can go with 18 again, and then button.pack. There you go. And you can see I can click that button. Since there is no padding, it is exactly below, directly below the text box. So we can go with some padding. Pad x equals 10, and pad y equals 10. Maybe you want to have some padding here as well. Pad y equals 10. And you can see now it looks a little bit better. Now this function doesn't have a functionality. Obviously, we are going to talk about that in a second, or not in a second, a couple of minutes, as I already told you. But those are some of the widgets, some of the most important widgets. We can also just type tk dot, and if you have an IDE, you're going to see what you can use here. So for example, we also have a check button here. We have frames. A frame is basically just a frame, an area that you can put buttons into, for example, or text boxes, just widgets. We have list boxes, we have menus and all that. So you can play around with that. Now let's try the grid layout, because the grid layout is a little bit more interesting when it comes to multiple buttons, for example, in a row. So if you want to have a calculator, for example, let's call up the Windows calculator. You don't want to have one button below the other buttons. You want to have a grid of buttons like here. So you want to have, for example, a text box, a label, and then you want to have some buttons here in a grid layout. If you want to do that in Python, first of all, I have a video on that, so you can just check out the GUI calculator with Tkinter on my channel. But now we're just going to have a grid of buttons, and for this we're actually going to use a button frame. So let me just think about this. We're going to use a label here in the pack layout. We're going to use a text box with a pack layout. And then we're going to add a frame. So the frame is going to be tk, or actually let's call it button frame is going to be tk.frame. The frame itself is going to be part of root. So it's going to have root as a master. And that's actually the only parameter that we pass here. But then we're going to say button frame dot configure, or actually column configure. And here we can set the 0th column to have a weight of 1. This is going to be important because we want the buttons to stretch. We don't want to have 3 buttons in a row and then a lot of space left and right. We want it to stretch to fill the x-axis, and we're going to talk about that in a second, how exactly we're going to do that. But this is a setting that we need. We need to say column configure for the individual rows, depending on how many rows you have. Obviously, if you have multiple, actually columns, sorry. If you have multiple columns, if you have 5 columns, you need to do it for all 5 of the columns. In this case, we're going to have 3 columns, so we're going to do it for the 3 columns here. And what we're doing now is we're going to say btn1 is going to be tk button. And here now, we're not going to pass root as the master. We're going to pass the button frame as the master, because the button is going to be inside of the button frame, and the button frame is going to be inside of the root. So we're going to pass button frame here, and the text is just going to be 1. We're not going to have any functionality here. We're going to say Arial and font size 18. And what we do now is we say btn1 dot, and now not pack, but grid. And grid takes the parameters row and column. So row 0 and column 0 basically means first row and first column. We're in programming, we start counting with 0, unless you use MATLAB, obviously. But that's where you start. So for example, we want to have the first button in the first row and the first column, so 0, 0. Now we also want it to be sticky to the west and to the east, so to the left and to the right. So what we can do is we can say sticky equals tk.w plus tk.e. I mean, I think you can also pass a string, so you should also be able to say W and E, or you can also say news for northeast, west, and south, yes. But I like to do it like that, tk.w plus tk.e for west and east. So basically what we want to have is, maybe I'm going to explain this with paint real quick. We don't want to have a window where we have like a text box and then a bunch of buttons like that, right? So if we have 3 columns here, we don't want to have a numpad like that. We want to do it more like that. We want to stretch the buttons here, of course, equally sized, not the way I draw them, but we want them to be stretched across the whole row. So we want it to be like that, 1, 2, 3. And this is why we do the sticky stuff. So we can copy that now and just paste this, how many times? 4 more times. So we have button 1, button 1. Here we have button 2, button 2, button 3, button 3, button 4, button 4, 5, 5, 6, 6. And of course we need to change the text to 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And now we can place them in different columns. So we can say, okay, we want to have button 2 also in the first row, but in the second column. So we change this to 1, this to 2. Then we want to have 3 buttons and start the next row. So button 4 would be in row 1, but column 0, then row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2. Those are actually just 2 rows, but we can actually take a look at that now. So once we have the grid, I think we only need to pack the frame. So we're going to say button frame dot pack, because remember we have the pack layout in general, but inside of the button frame we have the grid layout. So the grid layout of the application, or actually the layout of the application is not the grid layout, it's the pack layout, but inside of the button frame we have the grid layout. But because of that, we need to say button frame dot pack, and we're going to say fill equals x. Actually, as a string is enough. We can also pass tk.x, I think, but this means that it's going to stretch into the x dimension. And now you can see that we have the result that we wanted, a basic grid layout where we can do that. Now, before we move on, I also want to show you the place function. So instead of using grid or pack, we can also use the place function to place something manually. For example, down here I can say another button. It's going to be tk.button, and it's going to be part of root, and it's going to have a text test. And now we're going to say another button dot place, and I can just say x equals what's the geometry? 500 times 500. Let's just say 200 and 200 for y. And then I can say height equals, I don't know, 100, and width equals 100 as well. And by doing that, I can just decide on the position, because pack is a layout, we have a certain structure. Grid is a layout, we have a certain structure. We can manipulate parameters. Place basically means put it there and make it that size. So it's a very manual thing, and you can see that in this case it looks quite bad. But this is how you can place widgets exactly where you want. Alright, so I think you understand now basically how Tkinter works. We import the module, we create a root window, we add some widgets, and then we choose a layout, for example, grid or pack, or we use the place function to create our graphical user interface. Now the next step is to add some functionality. So to button clicks, for example, or to certain events that happen, we want to add some functionality to the graphical user interface so that it's more than just a design. And for this, we're going to define our graphical user interface inside of a class, because oftentimes it's a little bit tricky with the order in which you define the certain elements. So if you have the graphical user interface defined and then the functionality in terms of function, so you have a function that does something, this function maybe needs to know the graphical user interface in order to access certain elements. Then again, the graphical user interface needs to know the function, because the function is what is called when we do something. And this can get a little bit tricky. In a class, in an object, we have everything structured. So I can just say refer to that UI element via the self object, or refer to that function via the self object. It's just best practice or better practice to do it inside of a function. So let's say again, import Tkinter as tk, and then we're going to create a class myGUI like that. And in the constructor, we're going to have the whole graphical user interface process. So we're going to start with self.root is going to be tk.tk as before, and then self.root.mainLoop. So just calling the constructor is going to create the graphical user interface already. Now, so that we don't do just anything here, let's think about a very simple application. We're going to have a simple label at the top. We're going to have a text box where we can enter some text as a user. And then we're going to have a button. And when we click that button, we're going to get a message box with the text that we typed in the text box displayed onto the screen. And in addition, so that we use a little bit more UI elements, we're also going to add a checkbox. If that checkbox is checked, we're going to get the pop-up. If it's not checked, so if it's unchecked, we're going to get some console output. So we're going to get the message printed onto the console. If it's checked, we're going to get a pop-up. So let's start with the label. We're going to say self.label is going to be tk.label again, and it's going to be part of self.root. And we're going to say the text is your message, for example, and the font is going to be Arial 18, for example. Self.label.pack, padding x equals 10, padding y equals 10. Then self.text box, going to be tk text box or tk text, self.root and font equals Arial 16. Self.textbox.pack padx 10, pady 10, and of course don't forget the height. Let's say the height is 5 or something, should be enough. And then we're going to add the checkbox. So the checkbox is going to be self.check. It's going to be tk.checkButton. It's going to be part of self.root, and we're going to say the text is show message box, like that. And I don't think that we need much more for that. I mean, of course, yeah, we need to have the font size again, Arial and 18, or actually let's make this 16. Now, the check button in Tkinter is a little bit tricky because we cannot just intuitively go and say self.check is checked or something, and then we get true or false. We need to add a variable to that check button, and this variable is going to have the value of the check button. It's a little bit complicated. So let's first say self.check.pack padx equals 10, pady equals 10 as well. And before that, we're going to create now here self dot, let's just call this check state or something. And this is going to be tk.int var, int variable basically. And this int variable is going to have, this integer variable is going to have the state of the checkbox. And in order to get that, we need to say variable equals self.checkState, like that. And last but not least, let's add the button. Self.button is going to be tk.button, self.root. The text is going to be show message. Font is going to be Arial 18, self.button.pack. There you go. Now, in order to add the functionality, first of all, we're going to define the function itself. So we're going to say def, and we're going to call the function here show message, like that. And we're going to pass for now. And in order to make this function being executed when the button is clicked, we're just going to go to the end here and say command equals, and then self.show message. Now, it's important that you don't call the function, so you don't want to say show message and then parentheses like that, because we're not calling show message, we're passing show message as a parameter, and it's going to be called whenever we click the button. So if we, for example, write something like hello world here, and we create a my GUI object here at the bottom, and we run the script, we should be able that when I press, we should be able to see that when I press show message, we see hello world in the console. All right, so it works. Now, all we need to do is we need to show the message from the text box here onto the screen via message box, depending on the check. So the first thing is we want to know, okay, is the checkbox checked or not? Now, in order to get the state of this variable here, we need to now say print self.checkState.get, like that. This gets the state of the checkbox. So now if I run this, you're going to see that we're going to get a number. If I click it, you see 0. If I check and then click it, you see 1. So if the checkbox is unchecked, we're going to have 0, otherwise 1. And this is what we can look at. So we're going to say if self.checkState.get equals 0, then we're just going to print. What exactly are we going to print? We're going to print the content of the text box. So self.textbox. And this is again something that's a little bit tricky because in Tkinter we need to use the get function and provide a start and an end. So index 1, index 2. The index 1 is a string which is 1.0 if you want to start in the beginning. And if you want to stop in the end, so if you want to go all the way to the end, you have to pass tk.end. Now, this is a little bit unusual because in other frameworks, you would just say textbox.getValue or getText or .text. Here you need to say .get and you need to pass that as a beginning and this as an end if you want to get everything. And otherwise, if we don't get that, we're going to print a message box. And for that, we need to make an import. We need to say from Tkinter import message box, like that. And now we're just going to say message box dot show info, and the content, first of all, the title is going to be message, and the message itself is going to be self.textbox.get, again 1.0 tk.end, which basically means go all the way through. So this should already work. If I type something, there we go. And if I uncheck this, we see it in the command line instead of in a message box. So this works fine. What else did we want to do here? Now, one thing that I would like to add here, because this is something that a lot of people are asking when I do GUI tutorials, is how can I do something like when I'm in the text box, I don't want to click the button, I want to say enter, for example, and based on that click, based on that keyboard press, I want the same thing to happen. Now, in this case, enter would be a stupid choice because enter is something that we can use inside of the text box to change the text, but maybe want to have something like control enter, and control enter basically triggers that this function is executed as well. How can we do that? It's again a little bit tricky in Tkinter. It's not the most straightforward thing, but what we do here is we go to the text box and we say self.textbox, and then we can bind something here. We can bind a certain type of event to a function. For example, we can bind key press in angle brackets. This has to be that exact string. This thing has to be bound to self dot, and now we can define another function. For example, let's call it shortcut, and we can pass an event here. We have to pass an event here because the event is going to be passed by the bind function. So we bind the key press event to self.shortcut, and this automatically passes an event, and from that event object we can now look at what's happening. Now, one thing that I want to show you is that this event object has certain parameters. Now, if I run this, I'm not sure if we're going to see that. So if I'm now in the message box here, you can see that whenever I press something, we get a key press event down here. And this key press event has an event, a state here, and a key symbol. So what we're interested in is we want to have enter and we want to have control. Now, if I run this here and I just press enter, you can see the key symbol is return. Now, if I press control, you can see the key symbol is control. But if I hold control and I press enter, you can see that the key symbol was return, but the state was control mod 1. So if I run this again and I don't press control, I just press enter, you can see that the state was mod 1. If I now press control and enter, you can see control is part of the state. So all we need to do here in order to get the key combination is we need to print event.keySymbol, and we need to print event.state. And this is going to tell us what we need to look for, because if I now press enter, we get return and the state is 8. If I press control enter, the state is 12 and return is the button. So all I need to do here is I need to say if event dot state equals 12 and event dot key symbol equals return, then do something. For example, let's print hello for now to see if that works in the first place. So now if I press something else, nothing happens, but if I press control enter, we get hello. So this works. Now instead of printing hello, we're just going to call show message. So self.showMessage. And now you're going to see that if I have something in here and I now press Control Enter. Oh, of course we need to trigger that checkbox, otherwise we're not gonna get the message box. But you can see that this triggers the same thing as the button. So this works like that. Now, one thing that I would like to also show you is that sometimes, I mean, in this case, probably not, but sometimes you want to have some closing dialog. So when you press the close button, you don't want the application to just be closed, but maybe you want to ask the user, do you really want to leave, or do you want to save something? We're not going to talk about save dialogs and open dialogs and all that. I think in the editor video, in the Notepad clone, you're going to find that dialog, but besides that, or actually that was PyQt, but I think in the Paint clone, you're going to find save and open file dialogs. Today, we're going to only talk about the closing event. So what happens when I close the window? How can I react to that? So let's say maybe I just want to print hello world or goodbye whenever the user presses on the X button. Now, in order to get the event, what we need to do is we need to say self.root.protocol, and this is now a string which is called wm_delete_window, and what we pass here as a second parameter is the function that we want to call whenever this event happens. So whenever we click on the close button, we're going to call that function. Let's call it onClosing. And of course, we need to define it down here. So def onClosing. And in here, we're going to just say print hello world. And important, we need to also destroy the window, because if we don't do that, all that's going to happen is that I'm going to print hello world. When I click that, it's no longer going to close. So we need to say self.root.destroy. So again, there you go. Now, instead of printing hello world, we're going to ask for the user to confirm that the user wants to leave the application. So we're going to say, I need to look up the syntax again here, if message box dot, and now we can choose a dialog from here. We have something like ask question, ask retry cancel, ask yes no cancel, or ask yes no. This is what we're going to use here. Ask yes no, there you go. And we're going to pass a title, quit question mark, message equals do you really want to quit question mark. Now, if the answer to that is yes, we're going to have a positive value here. So this if statement is only going to be triggered if we press yes, and otherwise we're going to do nothing. So if I press on X now, do you really want to quit? No, nothing happens. Do you really want to quit? Yes, destroyed. Now, last but not least for this video, in order to just show you a little bit more UI elements, we're going to also add a menu to the top. So something like here in PyCharm with file, edit, view, and all that. We're going to keep it minimal, but I'm going to show you how you can just create a simple menu bar. And inside of that menu bar, you want to have different menus, for example, file and action or help or something. And then we can also add functionalities to the individual presses inside of that menu bar. So what we're going to do is we're going to say self.menubar, which is going to be the main thing. It's just going to be tk.menu, and it's going to be part of self.root. Then we're going to also create self.file menu, and this is going to be tk menu as well. So one menu is going to be part of the other menu, and this is going to be part of self.menubar. And we're going to also pass the parameter tear off, right? Is going to be 0, so that we have, otherwise we're going to have a dashed line at the top, and we don't want that. And inside of that file menu, we're now going to add some things that we can do. So for example, we can say self.filemenu.add command, and we're going to have a simple command with a label close. And this label close is going to have the command exit. We're going to refer to the basic Python exit function, and that's all it's going to do. Now, if I want to add this now to the to the menu bar, what I do is I say self.menubar.addCascade, and the menu I'm adding is self.filemenu, and the label of that menu is going to be file. And then last but not least, I think I need to also add the menu bar to the root, and we do that by saying self.root.config, and we set the menu of the root to be self.menu bar. So now if we run this, you can see we have file up here, and I can click on close, and it closes the window. Now actually we can also link this to not exit, but to self.onClosing. I think then it has the same effect as clicking this button, so no or yes. There you go. So this also works. Now we can also add multiple commands. I'm going to add the same command again, so we can say close with error or close without question, just so we have a second item here. We're going to pass exit here, and between those we're going to have a separator. So we can also say file menu dot add separator, and this may be useful if you have a lot of different options of different categories. You can have this separator line between these two buttons here, or between these two commands. Now let's just so that we see that this also works, let's just add another menu. So action menu, for example, is going to be tk menu, part of self.menu bar, tear off 0. Not sure how it's pronounced. Tear off. I think tear off makes more sense, right? Let me know in the comment section down below. So action menu dot add command, and we can just say, I don't know, label is going to be show message, and the command is going to be self.show message, like that. Then again, self.menu bar, actually let's do it down here, add cascade, self.action menu, and label is going to be action. There you go. So now we have action, so show message, like that. If we have the message box checked, this is going to work as well. One final thing that I want to show you is if you want to, for some reason, clear the text box, let's create a second button, self.clear button, and this button shall delete the content of the box. So let me just write it real quick. Text equals clear, font equals Arial 16, no, 18 actually. The command is going to be self.clear, and we're going to define it. Self.clear button.pack with padding. And if we want to do that, we need to do something similar to the getting here. So we need to also specify these indices. So what we're going to do is we're going to say def clear, and we're going to say self.text box.delete, and here we pass 1.0 and tk.end as far as I know. This is how it's done. So there you go. If I write something and click on clear, this clears the message box. Alright, so that's it for today's video. I hope I was able to give you a good introduction to Tkinter. If you liked that video, let me know in the comment section down below and click the like button. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to not miss a single future video for free. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video, and bye.